I'm Emma Sullivan, and 3 weeks ago, my family made it crystal clear that I wasn't welcome at my grandmother's will reading. They said I was ungrateful, that I didn't deserve to be there, and they had security escort me off the property like some kind of criminal. But what happened next shocked everyone in that room, including me. The lawyer had a surprise that completely flipped the script on my entire family, and by the end of this story, you'll see how one document changed everything and exposed the truth about who my relatives really are. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is about to take you on a wild ride of family drama, shocking revelations, and the kind of justice that feels almost too good to be true. My grandmother Maggie owned Oakwood Vineyard in Napa Valley, a stunning estate that had been in our family for 3 generations. The rolling hills covered in grapevines, the stone main house with its wraparound porch, the wine cellars that hosted tastings for visitors from around the world. It looked like something out of a magazine, but the beautiful property hid some ugly family secrets, and when the truth finally came out during that will reading, it revealed just how far some people will go for money and how wrong they can be about who really matters. I'm 26 years old, and until last month, I thought I understood what family loyalty meant. My relationship with Grandma Maggie was the cornerstone of my life. While everyone else in the family saw dollar signs when they looked at the vineyard, I saw the woman who taught me to identify different grape varieties by touch, who showed me how to read the soil and understand what the land was trying to tell us. Growing up, our family dynamics were complicated. To put it mildly, my Aunt Catherine, my mother's older sister, had appointed herself the family matriarch after my grandfather passed away 10 years ago. She married Uncle Richard, a tech executive who treated family gatherings like board meetings and conversations like networking opportunities. Their kids, my cousins Madison and Trevor, grew up thinking the vineyard was their personal playground and future inheritance. Emma, still driving that little Honda? Aunt Catherine would say during family dinners, her voice dripping with false concern. You know, now that you're out of college, maybe it's time to think about a real career. Something with actual earning potential. I had chosen marine biology and ocean conservation work, spending my days researching coastal ecosystems and working with environmental nonprofits to protect marine habitats. The pay was modest, but the work meant everything to me. Unfortunately, my family saw it as a phase I needed to outgrow. My mother, Susan, never stood up for me during these conversations. She was the younger sister who had married my father, David, a high school science teacher, and the family never let her forget that she had married down. She spent every family gathering trying to prove her worth, agreeing with Catherine's opinions even when they contradicted her own values. But Grandma Maggie was different. She understood that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to make the world better. While the rest of the family focused on expanding the vineyard's profit margins and wine ratings, she quietly supported environmental causes and taught me that the land we stewarded was more important than the money it generated. Your great-grandfather started this vineyard because he loved the earth, she told me once, as we walked through the rows of Cabernet Sauvignon. He wanted to work with nature, not against it. Some people have forgotten that. What I didn't know was how deep that forgotten wisdom would run, or how it would ultimately determine all our fates. The family saw me as the black sheep, the granddaughter who chose tide pools over trust funds. They had no idea that their assumptions about my relationship with Grandma Maggie were about to cost them everything, and that the person they tried to exclude would end up holding all the cards. So buckle up, because this story has more twists than the winding roads through wine country, and trust me, you're going to want to stick around for every single revelation. The Sullivan family gatherings at Oakwood Vineyard were like elaborate theater productions where everyone played carefully rehearsed roles. Catherine would arrive in her Tesla, designer sunglasses perched perfectly on her head, surveying the property like she was already planning renovations. Uncle Richard would immediately disappear into Grandma's study to discuss business matters, which really meant pressuring her about modernizing the vineyard's operations and expanding into luxury hospitality. My cousins Madison and Trevor treated these visits like they were touring their future kingdom. Madison, who worked in social media marketing for a tech startup, would spend hours taking Instagram photos around the property, captioning them with things like "Sunday vibes at the family estate" and "grateful for these roots." Trevor, fresh out of business school, would walk the vineyard rows with Uncle Richard, talking loudly about profit margins and competitive analysis. "Emma, you really should consider getting your MBA," Trevor told me during one particularly uncomfortable family barbecue. "I mean, marine biology is cute and all, but what's your 5-year plan? You can't save the oceans on a nonprofit salary forever." The irony was that my work actually connected directly to the vineyard's future. I was researching how climate change and ocean acidification were affecting California's coastal ecosystems, which had direct implications for the region's agricultural sustainability. But whenever I tried to discuss the environmental challenges facing wine country, I was met with polite disinterest or outright dismissal. "Always so serious about these environmental things," Catherine would say with a patronizing smile. "It's wonderful that you care, dear, but business is business. People need jobs, and we can't save the world by shutting down profitable industries." What my family didn't understand was that Grandma Maggie had been quietly implementing sustainable farming practices at Oakwood for years. She had converted sections of the vineyard to organic cultivation, installed solar panels on the winery buildings, and partnered with local conservation groups to protect the watershed that fed into nearby Monterey Bay. "The land has to come first," she explained to me one afternoon as we watched workers install new water-efficient irrigation systems. "If we destroy the environment that sustains us, all the profit in the world won't matter." These conversations always happened when we were alone. During family gatherings, Grandma kept her environmental initiatives low-key, knowing they would spark arguments about cost-effectiveness and return on investment. She had learned to pick her battles carefully, especially as she got older, and the family's interest in the vineyard's financial future intensified. My mother's position in all this was particularly painful to watch. Susan had been a passionate environmental science student in college, but years of trying to fit into Catherine's vision of family success had worn down her convictions. She would nod along when Uncle Richard talked about expanding the vineyard's commercial operations, even though I knew she privately worried about the environmental impact. "Your mother used to care about these things too," Grandma confided in me once, "but Catherine has a way of making people feel small for having principles that don't align with profit." The family's treatment of my career choice became increasingly hostile as I advanced in my field. When I published a research paper on microplastics in marine food chains, none of them mentioned it. When I received a grant to study kelp forest restoration, Catherine actually laughed and said, "How nice that someone is paying you to play in tide pools." But the real tension came from something none of them wanted to acknowledge: my special relationship with Grandma Maggie. While they visited for holidays and special occasions, I came by every other weekend, sometimes just to help with garden work or to listen to her stories about the vineyard's history. "Emma understands what this place really means," Grandma told me once while we were processing grapes during harvest season. "The rest of them see dollar signs. You see the legacy." What I didn't realize was how much this bothered the rest of the family. I started noticing subtle changes in their behavior. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. Family group texts would be mysteriously delayed getting to me. Catherine began making pointed comments about how much time I was spending at the vineyard. "It's so sweet how devoted Emma is to spending time here," she said during one family dinner, her tone suggesting it was anything but sweet. Though I do worry about Grandma getting too tired from all these visits. The seed of what would eventually become a full-scale family war had been planted. They saw my relationship with Grandma as a threat to their expectations, and they were already starting to plan how to neutralize that threat. I just had no idea how far they were willing to go, or how wrong they were about what Grandma Maggie really valued. Everything changed the spring I turned 25, when Grandma Maggie started having what she called dizzy spells. I first noticed it during one of our weekend walks through the vineyard when she had to stop and steady herself against a fence post, her face going pale beneath her sun hat. "Just got a little lightheaded," she said, waving off my concern. "Probably didn't drink enough water this morning." But the episodes became more frequent. During our next visit, she nearly fainted while we were checking on the new grape varietals she had been experimenting with in the South Vineyard. I insisted on driving her to see Dr. Sarah Bennett, her longtime physician, despite her protests that she was fine. The diagnosis was congestive heart failure. Not immediately life-threatening, Dr. Bennett explained, but serious enough to require significant lifestyle changes and regular monitoring. Grandma Maggie might have several good years left, or her condition could deteriorate rapidly. There was no way to predict which direction things would go. The most important thing is reducing stress and maintaining her normal routines as much as possible, Dr. Bennett told me privately after the appointment. Familiar environments and regular social interaction are crucial for patients with her condition. When the news reached the rest of the family, their response was swift and telling. Suddenly, relatives who had been too busy for regular visits were showing up at Oakwood every weekend. Catherine began bringing real estate magazines and brochures for luxury senior living communities, spreading them conspicuously around Grandma's coffee table. "Mother, we need to talk realistically about your care," Catherine announced during what had been planned as a quiet family dinner. "This vineyard is far too isolated if you have a medical emergency. There are beautiful facilities in San Francisco with full medical staff on site." "I'm not moving to some sterile facility," Grandma replied firmly, her voice carrying the authority that had once intimidated business partners twice her size. "This is my home, and Emma has already arranged for a nurse to check on me twice a week." Catherine's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her voice carefully controlled. "Emma isn't qualified to make medical decisions. She's a marine biologist, not a healthcare professional." "I consulted with Dr. Bennett before arranging anything," I interjected. "She agrees that staying in familiar surroundings is best for Grandma's overall well-being." "How convenient," Uncle Richard muttered from across the table. "Keeping Grandma isolated here certainly makes it easier for some people to have undue influence." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. I felt my cheeks burning as everyone's attention focused on me. "What exactly are you implying?" "I think we all know what he's implying," Catherine said, her mask of polite concern finally slipping. "You've been spending an awful lot of time here lately, Emma. And now you're making decisions about Mother's care without consulting the rest of the family." "I'm here because I care about her," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Not because I have some ulterior motive." "Of course not," Trevor said with a smirk. "I'm sure your nonprofit salary has nothing to do with your sudden interest in Grandma's well-being." That was when I finally lost my temper. I stood up from the dinner table, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "You people are unbelievable. Grandma has a serious medical condition, and all you can think about is money. I've been visiting her every other weekend for years, long before anyone mentioned her health problems." "Exactly," Catherine snapped. "Years of working your way into her good graces. Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" The room erupted into chaos. Uncle Richard accused me of manipulating an elderly woman for financial gain. Madison suggested I was taking advantage of Grandma's loneliness. Even my mother sat there silently, avoiding eye contact while my own family tore me apart. My father finally spoke up, his teacher's voice cutting through the noise. "That's enough. Everyone needs to calm down." But the damage was done. From that moment forward, I was labeled the opportunistic granddaughter who was taking advantage of Grandma Maggie's vulnerability. Catherine launched a systematic campaign to undermine my relationship with her, calling other family members to spread her version of events and even contacting some of Grandma's longtime friends to express concern about my influence. The tactics worked. When I arrived for my usual visit the following weekend, Bill Thompson, the estate caretaker, looked uncomfortable as he met me at the door. "Miss Emma," he said quietly, "your grandmother is resting." Mrs. Harrison called earlier and said it would be best if visits were scheduled through her from now on. I was devastated but not entirely surprised. Did Grandma actually say she didn't want to see me? Bill's expression told me everything I needed to know. "I think you should call Mrs. Harrison to arrange your next visit." Over the next few months, my access to Grandma became increasingly restricted. Phone calls were intercepted by the new live-in nurse Catherine had hired. Visits required advance approval and were frequently canceled at the last minute due to Grandma being too tired or having medical appointments. During one of our last real conversations, about 6 weeks before she passed, Grandma seemed unusually urgent despite her obvious fatigue. "Emma, I need you to promise me something," she said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "In the wine cellar, behind the 1987 Cabernet Reserve, there's a wooden box. I want you to have it, but don't open it until after I'm gone." "Grandma, you're going to be fine," I said, though we both knew that wasn't necessarily true. "Promise me," she insisted. "The box contains things that will help you understand why I've made certain decisions. And Emma, no matter what anyone tells you, remember that I love you and I'm proud of the woman you've become." I promised, though I had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. 2 weeks later, when I tried to visit, I was turned away at the gate by a security guard I'd never seen before. A week after that, Grandma Maggie was rushed to the hospital. 3 days later, she was gone. I never got to say goodbye, and I never got the chance to retrieve that wooden box from the wine cellar. The family had made sure of that. What I didn't know was that Grandma Maggie had anticipated their tactics, and she had prepared a surprise that would expose every one of their schemes. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was in the lab analyzing water samples from a kelp restoration site. My mother's voice was shaky, distant. "Emma, honey, Grandma passed away this morning. Peacefully, in her sleep." The words hit me like a rogue wave. Even though I knew her condition was serious, even though I'd been preparing myself for this possibility, the reality felt surreal. My grandmother, the woman who had been my anchor through every family storm, was gone. And I hadn't been there. "When is the funeral?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Saturday at St. Michael's. Catherine is handling all the arrangements." There was something in my mother's tone, a hesitancy that should have warned me about what was coming. The funeral was a perfectly orchestrated affair that felt more like a networking event than a memorial service. Catherine had invited what seemed like half of Napa Valley's wine industry, turning Grandma's goodbye into a showcase of the family's social connections. I sat in the back, feeling like an outsider at my own grandmother's funeral, watching strangers deliver eulogies about a woman they'd barely known. Catherine spoke about Grandma's business acumen and legacy of prosperity. Uncle Richard mentioned her commitment to family traditions. Trevor talked about the vineyard's bright future under proper stewardship. Not one person mentioned her environmental work, her quiet philanthropy, or the things she actually cared about. When I tried to approach the podium to speak, Catherine intercepted me with a cold smile. "We've already heard from all the scheduled speakers, dear. Perhaps you can share your memories at the reception." But at the reception, held at the vineyard's main house, I was systematically avoided. Family members would break off conversations when I approached. Even some of Grandma's longtime friends seemed uncomfortable talking to me, as if they'd been warned about something. The notification about the will reading came not through any official channel, but through a group text that Madison had clearly sent to the wrong chat. "Will reading Thursday, 3 p.m. at the Vineyard. Dress code, business formal." Finally, time to sort out the inheritance situation. Followed immediately by OMG, wrong group, sorry. The message was clearly meant to exclude me, but now I knew when and where. After everything that had happened, after being shut out of Grandma's final weeks, I wasn't going to let them bar me from this last chapter too. Thursday afternoon, I drove up the familiar winding road to Oakwood Vineyard, my heart pounding with a mixture of grief and determination. The parking area was full of luxury cars, Catherine's Tesla, Richard's BMW, several vehicles I didn't recognize belonging to extended family members who had crawled out of the woodwork now that there was money to be discussed. I walked up to the front door wearing the only professional outfit I owned, a simple black dress I'd bought for job interviews. Bill Thompson answered the door, his weathered face showing genuine surprise and what looked like concern. "Miss Emma," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder. "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm family, Bill. I have a right to be here." He nodded slowly and stepped aside, but I could see the worry in his eyes. The main living room was packed with relatives in expensive suits and designer dresses, their conversations stopping abruptly as I walked in. You could have heard a pin drop. Madison's eyes went wide with panic, and she immediately scurried off to find her mother. I took a seat in an empty chair near the back, trying to project more confidence than I felt. Catherine entered the room like a storm front, her face twisted with barely controlled fury. Uncle Richard followed close behind, his hand on her elbow as if he was trying to physically restrain her. "What are you doing here?" Catherine demanded, not bothering to lower her voice. "This is a private family meeting." "I'm family too," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Grandma was my grandmother." Catherine laughed, a harsh sound devoid of any warmth. "Family? You've spent the last 2 years manipulating a sick old woman and turning her against the people who actually cared about her. You weren't invited for a reason." The accusation stung, but I stood my ground. I never manipulated anyone. I loved her, and I spent time with her. That's more than most people in this room can say. "How dare you?" Catherine hissed, stepping closer. "We've already discussed how the estate will be divided according to Mother's wishes and family traditions. You were excluded because of your behavior." The room was completely silent now, everyone watching our confrontation with uncomfortable fascination. I looked around at faces that shared my DNA but felt like strangers. "I don't believe Grandma would have wanted me excluded," I said. "She never said anything to me about being cut out." "Of course she didn't," Trevor interjected with a smirk. "She was too kind to tell you directly that your constant manipulation was obvious to everyone." Uncle Richard stepped forward, attempting to play the role of reasonable mediator. "Emma, this is clearly an emotional time for everyone. Perhaps it would be best if you left now, and we can discuss any concerns you have later in a more appropriate setting." "I'm not leaving," I said firmly. "If there's a will reading, I have a right to be here." Catherine's face hardened with resolve. She pulled out her phone and made a brief call. "Yes, I need security at Oakwood Vineyard immediately. We have a trespassing situation." The humiliation was overwhelming. A security guard I'd never seen before appeared within minutes, looking uncomfortable, but determined to do his job. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property," he said apologetically. I looked around the room one more time, searching for anyone who might defend me. My mother was staring at the floor. My father was checking his phone. Even distant relatives I'd grown up with avoided my gaze. "Fine," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "But Grandma would be ashamed of all of you." I walked out with as much dignity as I could manage, the security guard following at a respectful distance. Once I reached my car, the tears came hard and fast. I sat behind the wheel sobbing, the grief of losing Grandma compounded by this final rejection from people who were supposed to be my family. I was fumbling for my keys, vision blurred by tears, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Don't leave. Wait in your car. Rebecca Mitchell, your grandmother's attorney. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, confused and emotionally drained. I'd never heard of Rebecca Mitchell and had no idea why Grandma's lawyer would be contacting me now, especially after I'd just been escorted off the property like a criminal. But something in that simple message gave me hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't over yet. 5 minutes later, a woman in her early 50s approached my car. She had short auburn hair, wore a crisp navy suit, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. She tapped gently on my passenger window. "Miss Sullivan? I'm Rebecca Mitchell, your grandmother's attorney. May I join you for a moment?" I unlocked the door, still wiping tears from my cheeks. Rebecca slid into the passenger seat and handed me a packet of tissues from her briefcase. "I'm sorry for what just happened in there," she said, her voice warm but professional. "I arrived late to find your family conducting some sort of unofficial discussion without me present." "They said everything was already decided," I managed to say between sniffles. "That Grandma's wishes were clear, and I wasn't supposed to be included." Rebecca's expression darkened. "That's impossible. No will can be executed without the presence of the appointed executor, which is me. Whatever they were discussing in there has no legal validity whatsoever." A tiny spark of hope flickered in my chest. "So what happens now?" "Now," Rebecca said, reaching into her briefcase, "we conduct the actual legal will reading. But before we go back in there, there's something you need to know." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Emma, your name is the primary beneficiary in your grandmother's will." I stared at her in complete disbelief. "What? That can't be right. What about my mother? My aunt? The rest of the family?" "There are provisions for others," Rebecca clarified, "but the bulk of the estate, including Oakwood Vineyard, goes to you. Your grandmother was very specific about her intentions." She handed me a blue folder containing legal documents. "This is a copy of the will. You should review it before we return to the house." With trembling hands, I opened the folder and scanned the first page. There it was, in black and white. "I, Margaret Rose Sullivan, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath Oakwood Vineyard and the majority of my estate to my granddaughter, Emma Rose Sullivan." "This doesn't make sense," I whispered. "Why would she do this? The family is going to be furious." "Your grandmother had her reasons," Rebecca said gently. "She spent months discussing this decision with me. She also anticipated the family's reaction, which is why she was so detailed in her instructions." I closed the folder, my mind reeling. What do we do now? "Now we go back in there, and I do my job as executor. Are you ready for that? I should warn you, it's not going to be pleasant." I thought about running, about avoiding the confrontation entirely. But Grandma had made this choice for a reason, and I owed it to her memory to see it through. "Yes," I said, straightening my shoulders. "I'm ready." We walked back to the house together, Rebecca slightly ahead of me. When Bill opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to something that almost looked like satisfaction. "Ms. Mitchell," he said with a formal nod. "They're waiting in the living room." The conversation died instantly when we entered. Catherine was the first to recover, her expression shifting from shock to barely contained rage. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "We asked her to leave." "And I've asked her to return," Rebecca replied smoothly. "As the executor of Margaret Sullivan's last will and testament, I cannot proceed without all relevant parties present." "Relevant parties?" Uncle Richard repeated, his businessman's instincts clearly sensing trouble. "What exactly does that mean?" Rebecca placed her briefcase on the coffee table and removed several official documents. "It means I'm here to conduct the official reading of Margaret Sullivan's will, which can only be done by me as the named executor. Whatever discussions you've had previously were premature and legally meaningless. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Madison and Trevor exchanged worried glances. My mother looked confused and frightened. Catherine's face had gone pale beneath her perfectly applied makeup. "But we already agreed on how things would be distributed," Catherine protested, her voice losing its earlier confidence. Mother and I discussed her wishes extensively. "I'm afraid any verbal agreements are superseded by the legal document Mrs. Sullivan signed and had properly witnessed," Rebecca replied, her tone professionally detached. "Now, if everyone would please be seated, we can proceed with the official reading." As everyone reluctantly took their seats, Rebecca caught my eye and gave me an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. I sat in the same chair I'd occupied earlier, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The room went completely silent as Rebecca put on her reading glasses and began to speak in a voice that commanded absolute attention. "This is the last will and testament of Margaret Rose Sullivan, dated September 3rd of this year, and witnessed by myself and Dr. Sarah Bennett. September 3rd. I quickly calculated that was just 2 weeks after the disastrous family dinner where Catherine had first suggested moving Grandma to a care facility. It was also shortly after my access to the vineyard had been restricted. Rebecca continued reading. "I, Margaret Rose Sullivan, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my final wishes regarding the distribution of my estate and assets." She paused, glancing around the room. Before specifying the distributions, Mrs. Sullivan included a personal statement that she requested be read in full. Catherine shifted impatiently. "Is that really necessary? Can't we just get to the relevant parts?" Rebecca fixed her with a stern look. "As executor, I'm legally obligated to read the will exactly as written. This is a legal proceeding, Mrs. Harrison, not a casual conversation." Properly chastised, Catherine fell silent, and Rebecca returned to the document. "To my family gathered here today, throughout my 83 years, I have learned that the true value of wealth lies not in its accumulation, but in how we choose to use it to reflect our deepest values. For too long, I have watched certain members of this family become consumed with material success at the expense of the principles that should guide us as human beings. I have seen kindness dismissed as weakness, environmental stewardship mocked as impractical idealism, and genuine care mistaken for manipulation. While some of you visited only when it served your interests, one person in this family has consistently demonstrated the values I hold most dear: respect for the land, commitment to making the world better, and unconditional love without expectation of reward. It is for these reasons that I have made the following decision regarding my estate." The room was so quiet you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I could feel every eye in the room turning toward me, some questioning, others beginning to understand the implications of Grandma's words. Rebecca turned the page and continued in her clear, authoritative voice. "I hereby bequeath Oakwood Vineyard, including all buildings, equipment, and acreage, along with the majority of my financial assets, to my granddaughter, Emma Rose Sullivan, who has shown herself to be the true inheritor of our family's values." The explosion that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The explosion was immediate and deafening. Catherine shot up from her chair like she'd been electrocuted, her face contorting with rage. "This is absolutely outrageous. She manipulated Mother when she was sick and vulnerable. That will is invalid," Uncle Richard shouted, his businessman's composure completely shattered. "Margaret wasn't in her right mind. We'll contest this immediately." Trevor was on his feet, pointing an accusing finger at me. "This is theft. She brainwashed Grandma against her own family." Madison burst into theatrical tears, wailing about family betrayal while simultaneously pulling out her phone, probably to post about this dramatic turn of events on social media. Through the chaos, I sat frozen in my chair, unable to process what was happening. The vineyard, the entire estate. Grandma had left it all to me. It seemed impossible, overwhelming, and frankly terrifying given the family's explosive reaction. Rebecca waited patiently for the initial storm to subside before raising her hand for silence. If I may continue, there are additional provisions in the will. The room gradually quieted, everyone too anxious to hear the rest to maintain their outbursts. Maybe there was still hope for them to get something. While the primary estate goes to Emma Sullivan, Rebecca continued, Mrs. Sullivan established a trust fund of $2 million to be distributed among other family members, contingent upon specific conditions. Hope visibly surged through the room. People sat up straighter, expressions shifting from outrage to calculation. $2 million was still significant money, even divided among multiple people. These conditional inheritances, Rebecca explained, consulting another document, are dependent upon the treatment of Emma Sullivan by family members, both before Mrs. Sullivan's death and following this will reading. The silence that followed was absolute. I could practically see the gears turning in everyone's heads as they mentally reviewed every interaction they'd had with me over the past few years. Mrs. Sullivan maintained detailed records of family interactions and behavior patterns, Rebecca continued, setting aside the will to reference a thick folder. She also consulted with me regularly about her observations, and she employed private investigators to document certain incidents she found particularly concerning. Private investigators? Uncle Richard's voice came out as a croak. My own mother-in-law spied on us? Mrs. Sullivan documented what she perceived as a coordinated campaign to isolate Emma from the family and from herself during her final months, Rebecca corrected firmly. Based on my observations today, her concerns appear to have been well-founded. She opened the thick folder and began reading from specific entries. October 15th. Catherine Harrison instructed Vineyard staff to tell Emma that Margaret was unavailable for visits, despite Margaret specifically requesting to see her granddaughter that same day. Catherine went pale. Mother was confused. She needed rest, not emotional manipulation. Dr. Bennett's notes from that day indicate Mrs. Sullivan was lucid and in good spirits, Rebecca countered. She specifically recommended family visits as beneficial to her mental health. Rebecca continued reading. November 3rd. Private investigator documented Richard Harrison telling other family members that Emma was working an angle and advised them to limit her access before she does more damage. Uncle Richard's face flushed deep red. That was taken out of context. We were concerned about Mother's well-being. November 20th. Catherine Harrison hired a live-in nurse with specific instructions to screen Emma's phone calls and visits. Quote, We can't have her influencing Mother's decisions during this vulnerable time. Financial matters need to be settled without interference. The evidence was damning, and everyone in the room knew it. The systematic campaign to exclude me had been documented in excruciating detail. As Rebecca continued reading incident after incident, I watched my family's faces cycle through shock, fear, and anger. They had been so confident in their manipulation, so certain they could control the narrative. They never imagined Grandma was watching and documenting everything. Now, regarding the specific conditional inheritances, Rebecca said, turning to a new page. Based on the documentation provided to me, I regret to inform you that currently, none of the family members present qualify for their portions of the trust. The resulting chaos made the previous outburst seem mild. Accusations flew across the room, most directed at me, some at Rebecca, and others at Grandma herself for this perceived betrayal. This is insane, Catherine shrieked. She's turned our own mother against us from beyond the grave. The will can't be legal, Trevor shouted. There has to be a way to challenge this. Through it all, Rebecca remained calm, occasionally referencing specific documents when particularly outrageous claims were made. I should note, Rebecca said when the noise finally died down, that Mrs. Sullivan had her mental competency officially evaluated by 3 independent physicians during the drafting of this will, specifically to address any potential challenges. The will is legally bulletproof. She then turned to me directly. Miss Sullivan, your grandmother also left you a private letter. Would you like to receive it now or later in private? All eyes turned to me. After a moment's hesitation, I said, later, please. In private. Rebecca nodded and returned to addressing the room. The conditional inheritances remain available to qualified family members for a period of 18 months following this reading. Mrs. Sullivan was very clear that she hoped reconciliation would be possible, though she left the specific terms entirely in Emma's hands. And with those words, every calculating gaze in the room shifted to me. In the span of 2 hours, I had gone from family outcast to the sole arbitrator of their financial futures. The realization was as terrifying as it was surreal. Catherine was the first to attempt damage control, her voice suddenly honey-sweet in a complete reversal from her earlier venom. Emma, sweetheart, this must be so overwhelming for you. Why don't you come stay with Richard and me for a few weeks? We have plenty of room, and we can help you navigate these complicated legal matters. The transparent attempt at manipulation was almost laughable. Thank you, but I'll be fine in my own apartment. Uncle Richard tried a different approach, sidling up with his boardroom demeanor. You know, Emma, managing an estate of this magnitude requires considerable expertise. I'd be happy to help you develop investment strategies. We could even create a family partnership that benefits everyone. I'll consider all my options carefully, I replied, deliberately keeping my response vague. My cousins were even more obvious. Trevor suddenly remembered all the fun times we'd had as kids, while Madison mentioned a charity gala she thought I might want to attend now that you'll be moving in different social circles. As I politely deflected these transparent overtures, I noticed my mother sitting quietly in the corner, tears streaming down her face. Unlike the others, she hadn't joined the accusations or the sudden attempts at reconciliation. When our eyes met across the room, she quickly looked away, guilt written across every feature. Finally, when I couldn't take another moment of the fake pleasantries and thinly veiled manipulation, I excused myself. I need some time to process all of this. Rebecca, could we schedule a meeting to discuss the details? As I headed toward the door, desperate for fresh air and space to think, my mother caught up with me in the foyer. Emma, please, can we talk? Just the two of us? Despite my emotional exhaustion, I nodded. We had 18 months to figure this out, but something in her expression told me this conversation couldn't wait. My mother and I walked to the vineyard's back patio, where Grandma used to serve afternoon tea overlooking the rolling hills of grapevines. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, and for a moment, I could almost pretend this was just another family visit. Emma, my mother began, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to apologize. For everything. For not standing up for you. For letting Catherine control the narrative. For being too weak to defend my own daughter. I sat down on one of the wrought iron chairs, emotionally drained from the afternoon's revelations. Why didn't you ever say anything? All those years of watching them treat me like an outsider, like I didn't belong. My mother sank into the chair across from me, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. I was terrified, she admitted. After I married your father, Catherine made it clear that my place in this family was conditional. When you chose marine biology over business, when you started spending so much time with Grandma, I was caught between protecting you and maintaining my own position. You chose them over me, I said quietly. Your own daughter. Tears streamed down her face. I thought if I stayed in their good graces, I could protect you better from the inside. I thought challenging them directly would make things worse for both of us. But I was wrong. I was a coward. and I failed you when you needed me most. We sat in silence for several minutes, years of hurt and disappointment hanging between us. Finally, my mother spoke again. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately. I know I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that I've always been proud of you. Your work, your principles, the way you stayed true to yourself despite all the pressure to conform. Grandma saw it too. That's why she did this. For the first time since the will reading, I felt something other than shock and fear. I don't know if I can handle this responsibility. The vineyard, the money, making decisions about everyone's inheritance. It's overwhelming. You don't have to decide everything today, my mother said gently. But Emma, your grandmother chose you for a reason. She saw something in you that the rest of us were too blind to recognize. Over the following weeks, I met regularly with Rebecca to understand the full scope of what I'd inherited. Oakwood Vineyard wasn't just a beautiful property, it was a thriving business with sustainable farming practices, a small but respected wine label, and partnerships with environmental organizations throughout California. Your grandmother was more forward-thinking than anyone realized, Rebecca explained during one of our meetings. She'd been quietly transitioning the vineyard toward complete carbon neutrality. The solar installations, the water conservation systems, the organic certification, it was all part of a larger vision. I also discovered the wooden box Grandma had mentioned, which Bill Thompson had quietly retrieved from the wine cellar and placed in my hands without fanfare. Inside were decades of correspondence with environmental scientists, plans for expanding the vineyard's conservation programs, and a letter addressed to me in Grandma's familiar handwriting. My dearest Emma, it read, if you're reading this, then my plan has worked. I'm leaving you this vineyard not as a burden, but as an opportunity to continue the work we both believe in. Use it to show that business and environmental stewardship can work hand in hand. Show your family that there's a different way to measure success. 3 months after the will reading, I made my decision about the conditional inheritances. I called a family meeting at the vineyard, and everyone attended. Their financial futures depended on it. I've given a lot of thought to Grandma's wishes, I began, standing in the same living room where my life had changed so dramatically. She wanted this to be an opportunity for healing and understanding, not just punishment. The room was silent, everyone hanging on my words. The conditional inheritances will be available as Grandma intended, I continued, but with one additional requirement that I believe honors her values. Each family member who wants to receive their portion must complete 200 hours of verified volunteer work with environmental or marine conservation organizations. The reaction was mixed. Catherine looked disgusted. Environmental work? That's ridiculous. We have careers and responsibilities. The requirement can be fulfilled over 18 months, I explained calmly, and the organizations offer flexible scheduling for working professionals. Uncle Richard started to protest about the unfairness of the condition, but my mother surprised everyone by speaking up. I'll do it, she said firmly. Not for the money, but because I want to understand what Emma and Grandma cared about. I want to make amends. Her words seemed to break something open in the room. Trevor, perhaps calculating that 200 hours of volunteer work was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, grudgingly agreed to consider it. Even Madison, after some dramatic sighing, admitted she might be able to fit it into her schedule. Catherine and Richard stormed out, making threats about legal challenges that we all knew would go nowhere. But watching them leave, I felt relief rather than sadness. Grandma had given me permission to set boundaries with people who would never respect me or the things I valued. 6 months later, Oakwood Vineyard hosted its first annual Environmental Stewardship Festival, bringing together conservationists, sustainable farmers, and community members to celebrate the intersection of agriculture and environmental protection. My mother was there, having discovered a genuine passion for coastal cleanup work that went far beyond fulfilling an obligation. I never understood what you saw in this before, she told me as we watched festival attendees touring the vineyard's solar installations. But now I get it. There's something really fulfilling about work that makes a difference. Trevor had also completed his volunteer hours, grudgingly at first, but eventually finding purpose in a sea turtle rescue program. We weren't close, but we were cordial, which felt like progress. As the sun set over the vineyard that evening, casting golden light across the sustainable gardens Grandma and I had planned together, I felt her presence more strongly than I had since her death. I had used her gift not just to secure my own future, but to create something that honored her values and brought out the best in the people around me. Standing in the vineyard that was now mine, surrounded by the community we'd built together, I finally understood what Grandma had really left me. Not just property or money, but the freedom to live according to my principles and the platform to make the changes I'd always dreamed of. The inheritance had revealed who my real family was, not just the people who shared my blood, but those who shared my values and commitment to making the world better. And in the end, that was worth more than any amount of money. What would you do if you inherited not just wealth, but the responsibility to use it to reflect your deepest values? Would you choose family loyalty or personal integrity? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the courage to stand up for what you believe in.